I heard the sergeant's voice cut through the air like a threat I had no intention of obeying. "You're going to keep your mouth shut and do exactly what we tell you. You understand me?" Sergeant Derek Watson's forearm crushed harder against my throat, pinning me against the cruiser in the fading afternoon light on Maple Avenue. Officer Tyler Armstrong stood behind me, both arms locked, cutting off my air. I didn't struggle or beg. I stood completely still, feet planted on the asphalt, eyes forward, breathing through the pressure with a control that looked from the outside like surrender. It wasn't surrender. What Sergeant Watson and Officer Armstrong didn't know was that the woman they were choking had briefed generals, and my next words were about to end both of their careers. The bedroom smelled like lavender and old wood. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed and didn't move. The floral curtains, the Bible on the nightstand with its spine cracked from years of use, the little ceramic angel on the dresser that had been there since I was 4 years old. Everything exactly where Evelyn Morgan had left it. Everything exactly the same, except Evelyn was gone. I turned the photograph over in my hands. My mother at 60 standing in the front yard of this very house, squinting into the sun with that look she always had, like she was daring the world to try something. 81 years old when she passed. 81 years in Maplewood, Georgia. 81 years of holding this family together with both hands. I set the photo down carefully on the nightstand right beside the Bible. I was 36 years old. I'd briefed 4-star generals. I'd sat in rooms inside the Pentagon that most people didn't know existed. I held a security clearance so high that most people I met had never even heard the classification level. I was by every measure I knew how to use someone who had made it. And right then, sitting in my mother's bedroom in Maplewood, I felt about 12 years old. I'd left this house at 18 and never really come back. West Point first, then Army intelligence, then the contracting work, the clearances, the career that had taken me so far from this street that sometimes it felt like another life entirely. I came back for holidays when I could, once when Ryan had his surgery, and now this. My Pentagon ID badge was locked in the glove compartment of my rental car outside. I hadn't brought it inside. It didn't belong here, not in this room, not that night. The front door opened. Heavy footsteps in the hall. I'd known that walk my whole life. Ryan Morgan filled the bedroom doorway. 58 years old, broad-shouldered with our mother's same dark eyes and a face that had seen too much sun and too much stress. He was 22 years older than me. When I was born, he was already a grown man. He'd always been more like a second father than a brother. He looked at me now the way he'd always looked at me, like he was still a little amazed I existed. "You eat anything today?" he asked. "I'm fine." He didn't push. He went to the kitchen, and I heard the clink of cups, the rush of water. When I came out and sat at the table, there were 2 mugs of coffee waiting. Our mother's mugs, our mother's table. We sat together in the quiet. It was Ryan who spoke first. "Maplewood's gotten worse," he said, not dramatically, like he was reading something off a list. "Watson's unit. They run the whole west side now, every street, every corner." I wrapped my hands around my mug. "How bad?" "Last month alone, 3 stops on this street." He nodded toward the front window. "Oak Street, right outside this house." He paused. "You remember Mrs. Harper lives 2 blocks down? Her grandson, 22 years old, coming home from work. They pulled him over, threw him up against the hood, his jaw tightened, broke his wrist." I went very still. "Did she file a complaint?" Ryan looked at me. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger exactly. Older than anger. Heavier. "People file complaints," he said. "Nothing happens. That's how it works here." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly on Oak Street, and I watched its headlights slide across the wall. I thought about what I knew about power, about the men I'd watched abuse it in boardrooms, in briefing rooms, in places that operated far above the law. The game was always the same. The stakes just changed. "What's his name again?" I asked. "The sergeant. Watson. Derek Watson. 22 years on the force and not one thing on his record." Ryan wrapped both hands around his mug. "Not one thing." I nodded slowly, filed it away in the part of my mind where things didn't get forgotten. We talked a little longer about the estate, about the paperwork at the county clerk, about what needed to happen before the end of the week. Practical things, the kinds of things that kept grief at arm's length long enough to get through the day. Eventually, Ryan left. Eventually, the house went quiet. I went back to my mother's bedroom, lay down on top of the covers and stared at the ceiling in the dark. I didn't know yet that by the next day everything would change. The pharmacy was 2 miles away. That was it. 2 miles there, 2 miles back, and I would have the notarized estate document in hand before the county clerk opened. The document was the last piece of paperwork standing between me and the formal transfer of my mother's house to Ryan. A single signature from the notary on duty at the Maplewood Pharmacy, the only place in town that still offered the service without an appointment. I grabbed my keys off the counter, told myself I'd be back soon, and stepped out into the Georgia afternoon. The sun was still up but leaning toward the horizon, casting long gold shadows across Oak Street. The air was warm and thick, the way southern afternoons get in early fall. The streets were quiet. Most people were still at work or just getting home. I pulled out of the driveway, headed south, and let the hum of the rental car fill the silence. I almost didn't notice the cruiser. It was sitting half a block back with its lights off, tucked against the curb like it was parked. I clocked it out of habit. I always clocked things, always cataloged my surroundings, but didn't think much of it. I turned onto Maple Avenue. The cruiser pulled out behind me. I kept my speed steady, both hands on the wheel. 2 blocks from the pharmacy, the lights came on. Red and blue flooded my rearview mirror. The siren gave one short, sharp blip. Pull over. I took a slow breath through my nose and guided the car to the curb. I cut the engine, put both hands on top of the steering wheel, and waited. I heard the cruiser doors, 2 of them. The officer who reached my window first was thick-necked, mid-40s, with a face like a closed fist. His name tag read, Watson. He held a flashlight and shone it directly in my face, despite the afternoon light still being more than adequate. License and registration. I didn't move quickly. I moved carefully, deliberately, the way you move when you know you're being watched for any reason to escalate. I retrieved both from the glove compartment. My Pentagon ID was in there too, tucked in its case, and I left it alone for now and held them out through the window. Watson took them, barely looked at them. You know why I stopped you? No, I said. I don't. Taillights out. I kept my voice even. My taillight was functioning when I left the house. Watson's eyes moved over me slowly. The car, my clothes, my face, the particular kind of look that wasn't really looking. It was deciding. He'd already decided before he got out of the cruiser. I could see it in him as plainly as I could see the badge on his chest. Step out of the vehicle. Can you tell me the reason? I said, Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. I got out, stood on the sidewalk with my hands visible. The second officer, younger, maybe 30, name tag Armstrong, had come around the front of the car and was hanging back slightly, watching Watson the way a dog watches its owner at the dinner table. 20 feet away on the sidewalk across the street, a young woman had stopped walking. She was holding her phone at her side. Then, slowly, quietly, she raised it. Hands behind your back, Watson said. I haven't been told what I'm being detained for, I said. My voice was steady, completely steady. I'm asking you to tell me the reason for this detention. Something shifted in Watson's face, not anger. He was already past anger. It was something colder, the look of a man who was not used to being questioned and did not intend to start tolerating it now. He turned his head toward Armstrong. Secure her. Armstrong moved fast. He stepped behind me before I could turn, and his forearm came up hard across my throat. The pressure was immediate, real. My airway didn't close completely, but the message was unmistakable. Stop moving. Stop talking. Stop existing in a way that inconveniences us. Every nerve in my body fired at once. 8 years of Army training lit up in me like a switch had been thrown. I knew exactly how to break this hold. I could do it in under 2 seconds, and Armstrong would be on the ground before Watson could blink. I didn't move because I also knew what happened next if I did. I had seen the headlines. I had read the names. I knew with a cold and terrible clarity that my training was not protection out here on this sidewalk, not on this street, not in this city. So I went completely still. And across the street, Emma Harper kept her phone perfectly steady and kept filming. Armstrong's forearm pressed harder. I felt the burn in my throat, the way my pulse thudded against the pressure of his arm. The afternoon sun was still warm on my face. A car passed slowly on Maple Avenue and didn't stop. Nobody stopped. I breathed in through my nose, out slow. My Army instructors used to say that panic was just energy without direction. I'd learned over 8 years of service how to take that energy and point it somewhere useful. I pointed it now at the only weapon I had left, my voice. "I need you to stop," I said it clearly. No trembling, no begging. "My name is Dr. Kayla Morgan. I'm a senior defense analyst contracted to the Pentagon's Office of Special Programs. I hold a TSSCI security clearance, and I'm expected at a briefing at Fort Moore the next morning." I paused just long enough to let that land. "If you do not remove your hands from my person in the next 10 seconds, the next call on your radio will be from the Department of Defense." Silence. Complete, total silence. Armstrong's arm dropped, not slowly. All at once, like a string had been cut. He stepped back and said nothing, his face caught somewhere between confusion and something that looked very much like the beginning of fear. He was 31 years old, and had likely never heard anyone speak to a superior officer, which is exactly what I had just positioned myself as, with that kind of absolute immovable calm. Watson hadn't moved. He was staring at me with his flashlight still raised, and for the first time since he'd walked up to my window, he looked uncertain. I looked straight back at him and did not blink. "Prove it," Watson said finally. His voice had lost some of its edge, not all of it, but enough that I noticed. I turned toward my car. My throat was already aching, a deep throbbing soreness that I knew from experience would be worse by morning. I opened the passenger door, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out the black case. I unzipped it and removed my Pentagon contractor ID. I walked back to Watson and held it out. He took it. He looked at it for a long time, longer than he needed to. The photo matched my face. There was no way around that. The name matched. The title, Senior Defense Analyst, Office of Special Programs, was printed in clean black type. And at the bottom, the clearance designation. 4 letters that Watson clearly recognized were serious, but couldn't fully decode. That was the part that got him. I could see it. The thing he didn't understand was more frightening to him than the thing he did. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped near his eye. He held the ID out without looking at me. "Get your tail light fixed," he said. His voice was flat now, emptied out. He walked back to the cruiser. Armstrong followed without a word, without looking at me, like a man trying to leave a room he'd never been in. The cruiser pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. I stood on the sidewalk and watched until the taillights were gone. My hand was steady, my face was steady. Inside my chest, my heart was hitting hard and fast, the way it used to after a training exercise. When the adrenaline finally had permission to show itself, I became aware of movement across the street. The young woman who had been filming walked toward me. She was maybe 29, natural hair pulled back, work uniform still on like she'd just finished a shift. Her eyes were wide, but her expression was clear and determined. "I got everything," she said quietly. From the second the lights came on, all of it, she turned the phone screen toward me. I watched it. The footage was steady. The audio was clean. Armstrong's arm across my throat. Watson standing there watching it happen, my voice cutting through the silence. The moment Armstrong stepped back. All of it. In clear afternoon light, unambiguous and complete. "What do you want me to do with it?" the young woman asked. I looked up from the screen. "What's your name?" "Emma. Emma Harper." I looked at the footage one more time. Then I looked at Watson's empty cruiser spot on the curb. Then I looked at the bruises I could already feel forming on my throat. "Hold on to it," I said. "Don't send it to anyone yet. Don't post it. Can you do that?" Emma nodded. "Good." I zipped my ID back into its case. "I'll be in touch." I didn't go to the pharmacy. I drove straight back to my mother's house, parked the rental, and sat in the driveway for a moment with both hands in my lap. The notarized document could wait until morning. I had bigger problems now. Inside, I went directly to the bathroom mirror. The bruising had already started. A band of deep reddish purple across the front of my throat, wider on the left side where Armstrong's forearm had pressed hardest. I took my phone out and photographed it carefully, straight on first, then both angles. I kept my face out of the frame and focused only on my neck, making sure the light was clear and the bruising visible. Then, I sent the photos to my own email and saved them to 2 separate folders on my phone. Evidence. That was what my life was now. I changed into a clean shirt and sat down at my mother's kitchen table with my laptop. I opened a fresh document and began typing. Time, location, names, badge numbers I had memorized from their name tags, the exact words spoken, the exact sequence of events. I wrote it the way I wrote intelligence reports, clean, precise, nothing left out, nothing exaggerated. I was halfway through when I heard Ryan's key in the front door. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at my throat. The color drained from his face. What happened? It wasn't a question. I told him anyway. All of it. From the cruiser pulling out behind me, to Armstrong's arm, to Watson's face when he read the clearance designation on my ID. I told it straight. No drama. The same way I'd just written it down. When I finished, Ryan pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily, like his legs had decided they were done holding him up. Watson, he said quietly. Watson, I confirmed. He stared at the table for a moment, then he picked up his phone and began scrolling. I watched his face while he did it, the way it moved through something complicated, something I didn't have a full name for yet. He found what he was looking for and slid the phone across the table to me without a word. It was a city government page, the Maplewood Civilian Police Oversight Board, 7 members. I read the appointment records. Then I read them again. Every single member had been appointed by Mayor Leonard Lang. Everyone. His brother-in-law is Watson, Ryan said, has been for 12 years. I set the phone down. I felt something cold move through me. Not surprise exactly. Something worse than surprise. The particular feeling of watching a trap become visible only after I'd already stepped into it. There's more, Ryan said. He took the phone back, pulled up something else, and handed it over again. I read through 3 separate complaint records, all filed against Watson in the last 2 years. The first was from Henry Bell, 67 years old, a deacon at First Baptist on Church Street. His arm had been fractured during a traffic stop. He'd filed a detailed formal complaint with photographs and a witness statement, dismissed in 26 days. The second complainant, a 40-year-old schoolteacher named Hannah Moore, had filed after her teenage son was stopped and searched without cause 3 times in a single month, dismissed in 30 days. The third complainant had filed after a confrontation outside a grocery store that left him with a concussion. His complaint was dismissed in 19 days. He was arrested 4 months later on a disorderly conduct charge. The charge was eventually dropped but sat on his record like a warning sign to anyone watching. 3 people, 3 complaints, 3 doors slammed shut. I closed the laptop. The oversight board is a rubber stamp, I said. Always has been, Ryan said. Lang built it that way. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was fading from gold to gray. Somewhere on Oak Street, a dog was barking. Everything was completely ordinary and completely wrong at the same time. I looked at my Pentagon ID on the table beside my laptop. Then, I looked at the photograph of my bruised throat, still open on my phone screen. Then, I looked at Ryan. Then we don't go through the city, I said. Ryan held my gaze for a long moment. He had 22 years on me. He had watched this city operate for decades. He knew better than anyone what going up against Watson and Lang would cost. He nodded slowly. Then what? We go over them, I said. We go federal. We stayed at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, planning exactly how. I was up before sunrise. I hadn't slept much, maybe 3 hours, broken and shallow, my mind running through checklists the way it did before a big operation. Early that morning, I was at the kitchen table with coffee, my laptop open, and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes from the night before. I started with the Pentagon's legal liaison. His name was Barry Olson, a civilian attorney who handled contractor legal matters for the Office of Special Programs. I had called him once before, 2 years ago, over a contract dispute that turned out to be a clerical error. He was thorough and careful, and I trusted him. I sent him a detailed email, the incident report I had typed the night before, the photographs of my bruising, and a summary of Emma Harper's footage. I flagged it urgent and asked for a call back before 9. Then, I opened the DOJ's Civil Rights Division complaint portal. I had never filed a federal complaint before. I had helped other people navigate bureaucratic systems plenty of times, but this felt different. This was my name on the form, my throat in the photographs, my city. I filled out every field methodically, attached every document, double-checked every detail. When I hit submit, I sat back and looked at the confirmation number on the screen for a moment before writing it down on the legal pad. One step, then the next. I called Emma at 8. Emma picked up on the second ring, her voice a little rough, like she hadn't slept well either. I explained what I needed, the footage transferred to a secure file-sharing link that I would set up, and a brief written account of what Emma had witnessed, in her own words, signed and dated. "Is this going to get complicated?" Emma asked. "It's already complicated," I said honestly. "But the footage is the strongest piece of evidence we have. I need it preserved properly." A pause. "Okay," Emma said. "Tell me what to do." I walked her through it step by step. When it was done, I uploaded the footage to 3 separate secure servers. One cloud account, one encrypted external backup I carried in my laptop bag, and one I sent directly to Olson's secure intake system at the Pentagon liaison office. Barry Olson called shortly after. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the full account. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Kayla," he said carefully, "the bruising photographs alone are significant. Combined with the footage, this is a serious matter." He told me he would escalate internally and advised me to also contact a civilian civil rights attorney to pursue a parallel track outside of federal contractor channels. "You want multiple ropes on this thing," he said. "Don't rely on one." Good advice. I wrote it down. I was researching civil rights attorneys in Atlanta when Councilwoman Felicia Warren called. I had sent her a message the night before, a brief introduction through Ryan, who knew Warren from community board meetings. I hadn't expected to hear back so quickly. Warren's voice was sharp and direct, the voice of a woman who had stopped softening herself for other people's comfort a long time ago. "I've been trying to move against Watson for 3 years, she said without preamble. 3 years of complaints that go nowhere, community meetings that change nothing, and a mayor who acts like I'm speaking a foreign language." She paused. "Send me the footage." I sent it while we were still on the phone. I heard Warren watching it on the other end. The silence was thick. Then, "Lord." Another pause. "You said you have medical documentation of the injuries." "Photographed it yesterday and formally documented it this afternoon," I said. "I'm taking Ryan with me to the county medical office after lunch." "Good. Don't skip that step." Warren's tone shifted into something focused and almost warm. "You might be exactly what this city has been waiting for." That afternoon, Ryan drove me to the county medical office on Willow Street. The physician on duty, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Carla Stevens, examined my throat, photographed the bruising under clinical lighting, and wrote a formal injury report documenting the contusion pattern as consistent with a forearm compression hold. She handed me 2 copies. On the drive back to Oak Street, Ryan didn't say much. Neither did I. Inside the house, I sat down at the kitchen table and laid everything out in front of me. The complaint confirmation number, the medical report, the secured footage, the legal pad full of notes. For the first time since the stop, I allowed myself to feel something close to hope. I didn't know yet how quickly that feeling was going to be taken from me. My phone rang early one morning. I was already awake, already at the kitchen table with coffee, already going over the legal pad from the night before. I looked at the screen. Councilwoman Warren. I picked up. "Have you seen the Gazette?" Warren didn't bother with hello. "Not yet. Pull it up right now." I opened my laptop and found the Maplewood Gazette's website. The story was small. 4 paragraphs buried below the fold on the local news page. Easy to miss if you didn't know to look for it. I read it once fast, then again slowly. Local woman makes unverified federal claims during routine traffic stop. My stomach tightened. The article described an unnamed woman who had become agitated and uncooperative during a routine stop on Maple Avenue. It said she had made unsubstantiated claims of government employment when officers attempted to conduct a lawful investigation. It quoted an unnamed police department spokesperson saying the stop had been standard procedure and that the woman's behavior had escalated the situation unnecessarily. There was no mention of a chokehold, no mention of bruising, no mention of a Pentagon ID that Watson had held in his own hands. I was the problem. That was the story they were telling. Watson filed a counter-report yesterday afternoon, Warren said. Her voice was tight with fury. She was working hard to contain. I have a source inside the department. He described you as erratic, aggressive, and claimed you obstructed a lawful investigation. Lang's office fed the story to the Gazette the same evening. A short pause. They move fast. I'll give them that. I stared at the article. I thought about the bruise photographs on my phone. I thought about Emma's footage sitting on 3 secure servers. I thought about the formal DOJ complaint with its confirmation number written in blue ink on my legal pad. I closed the laptop. How old are you? Warren asked suddenly. 36? Silence on the line. Then, I was afraid of that. Listen to me carefully, Kayla. They are going to use that every chance they get. They are going to push the idea that you are too young, too emotional, too eager to make a name for yourself, that this is some kind of overreaction from a girl who doesn't know how things work. Her voice was hard and clear. Do not give them a single thing that fits that picture. Not one. Understood, I said. I ended the call and looked at Ryan, who had come downstairs during the conversation and was leaning against the kitchen doorframe in his bathrobe, watching my face read the situation. They went to the press, I said. He nodded like he'd been expecting it. That's what they do first. They make you the story. I pulled up my contacts and found the name I'd written down the night before, after Barry Olson's recommendation. Jason Powell, Atlanta-based civil rights attorney with 20 years of experience and a reputation that Olson had described in 3 words: thorough, aggressive, effective. Powell picked up on the third ring. I gave him the same briefing I had given Olson: tight, sequential, nothing wasted. When I finished, he asked 4 questions: short, sharp, precise. Did I have medical documentation? Yes. Was the footage time-stamped and unedited? Yes. Were there any prior complaints against the officer on public record? Unknown, but suspected. Had I filed with the DOJ? Yes, confirmation number in hand. Send me everything, Powell said, all of it. I want the footage, the medical report, the complaint confirmation, the photographs, and the Gazette article. A brief pause. If what you're describing is accurate, and I have no reason to think it isn't, this is not a difficult case. What it is a dirty fight. These men have been running this playbook for a long time, and they are comfortable with it. How long will it take to review? I asked. Give me 2 hours. He called back in 90 minutes. He was taking the case. That evening, Ryan, Powell, and I were on a 3-way call at the kitchen table. Powell had already begun pulling Watson's public complaint history from city records. What he was finding, he said carefully, suggested a pattern that went back much further than 2 years. When the call ended, the house was quiet. Ryan poured us both a glass of water and sat back down. Outside, Oak Street was dark and still. I looked at my mother's photograph on the wall. Watson thought he had killed this story before it could breathe. He had no idea it had just learned to run. The call came at 7 in the evening. I was at the kitchen table reviewing the documents Jason Powell had sent over when my phone buzzed. Emma Harper. I picked up immediately. They pulled me over. Emma's voice was unsteady in a way it hadn't been before, thin at the edges, like something was pulling it apart. 20 minutes ago, right outside my apartment complex. I set my pen down. Which officer? The young one, Armstrong. He was alone. A shaky breath. His dash cam wasn't working. He said it was a technical issue. Of course it was. What did he cite you for? Emma let out a short, humorless sound. 3 things. Failure to signal a lane change, expired registration, and a cracked windshield. A pause. Kayla, my registration is current. I renewed it in July. I have the receipt on my refrigerator right now. I stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, Oak Street was quiet and amber under the streetlights. I kept my voice calm. Did he say anything else? He didn't have to. Emma's voice dropped lower. He just stood there with that look, like he was enjoying it, like he wanted me to know exactly why he was there. Another pause. And when she spoke again, there was something underneath the fear, something raw and tired. I have a 6-year-old Kayla. I work 2 jobs. I can't. I don't know if I can keep doing this. I pressed my hand flat against the window frame and stared at the street below. This was the part they didn't show in the headlines, not the dramatic confrontation, not the moment of visible cruelty that got filmed and shared. This part, the quiet, grinding, targeted pressure applied to the most vulnerable person in the chain. Watson didn't need to come for Emma herself. He just needed her to disappear, to decide it wasn't worth it, to delete the footage and go back to her 2 jobs and her 6-year-old and pretend she hadn't seen anything on Maple Avenue 2 days ago. It was efficient, it was cruel, and it worked. That was the worst part. It worked all the time on people who had every reason in the world to protect themselves instead of strangers. I turned away from the window. Emma, my voice was steady and deliberate, I need you to listen to me. What Armstrong just did, citing you on fabricated violations the day after you filmed that footage, that is witness intimidation. That is a crime. And we are going to add it to the case. I paused. But I need you to hold on. Can you give me 72 hours? Silence on the other end. They know where I live, Emma said quietly. I know. I didn't dress it up. Emma was too smart for that, and had been through too much in the last 48 hours to deserve anything less than the truth. They are trying to scare you because you are the witness. That means you matter. That means what you filmed matters. A beat. They will not touch you, I promise you that, but I need 72 hours. A long pause. Then, okay, Emma said. Okay. I hung up and immediately called Jason Powell. He picked up on the first ring. I told him everything. The stop, Armstrong alone, the malfunctioning dash cam, the fabricated registration violation. Powell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a new edge to it, sharper, focused. The registration is the mistake, he said. If she has documentation showing it was renewed in July, that citation is provably false. That is not a gray area. That is an officer of the law filing a fraudulent citation against a material witness. Another pause. I'm adding Emma Harper to this case tonight. Send her my number. I sent it before I was even off the phone with him. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after the calls ended. Ryan was in the living room, and I could hear the low murmur of the television. The house smelled like the coffee I'd let go cold on the counter. I thought about Emma's voice, that thin, fraying edge in it. 29 years old, working 2 jobs, raising a daughter, and now carrying something that no one had asked her permission to hand her. I thought about all the Emmas that came before, the ones who had no one to call, the ones who deleted the footage, the ones the machine had successfully ground down into silence. I picked up my cold coffee and poured it down the sink. Not this time. I came downstairs at 7 in the morning and found Ryan already at the kitchen table. His coffee was in front of him, untouched and cold. He was still in his pajamas, both hands flat on the table, staring at nothing. Not the wall, not the window, nothing. The look on his face was the look of a man who had made a decision in the night and was still sitting with the weight of it. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him. I didn't say anything. I had learned growing up with Ryan that he couldn't be pulled toward a thing. He had to arrive at it himself in his own time. I waited. He spoke without looking up. In 2009, he said, there was a young man named Zane Tucker. I went still. 24 years old. Worked at the hardware store on 5th Street. Good kid. Everybody knew him. Ryan's voice was flat and careful, the way voices get when they've been rehearsing something for a long time and are finally saying it out loud. He got pulled over one night in August, 3 blocks from his mother's house. A pause. He didn't make it home. The kitchen was completely quiet. Watson was on scene. Ryan said he was a patrol officer back then. There were 2 others with him, but Watson was the one. He stopped, started again. I was there. I just left a school board meeting and I was driving home on that same street. I saw the lights. I pulled over because something felt wrong. His jaw tightened. Something was wrong. Wolfdalf, I set my cup down slowly. I gave a statement, Ryan said. Told them exactly what I saw. Names, times, the whole thing. He finally looked up at me. His eyes were dry but hollowed out in a way that was harder to look at than tears. My statement disappeared, gone like it never existed. And then one of Lang's people came by the school. Not threatening, nothing you could point to, just a friendly visit to say how much the city appreciated Principal Morgan and how they hoped everything at Jefferson High was going well. Ryan, I had 400 kids in that building, he said. 400 kids who needed me to show up every morning. I had this house and Mom inside it. I watched what happened to the people who pushed back against Watson in this city. And he stopped again, put one hand over his mouth briefly, then lowered it. I made a choice, and I have lived inside that choice for 15 years. The silence between us was vast and full of everything that had ever separated us. The 22 years of age, the different paths, the fact that I had left and he had stayed, and what each of those decisions had cost. I thought about being 12 years old and watching Ryan drive away to his own life. Already a man, already shaped by a version of Maplewood I was too young to fully see yet. I thought about all the years I had spent building my career in rooms far from this city, believing that distance was the same thing as safety. It wasn't. It had never been. It had just been distance. Why now? I asked, not accusingly. I genuinely needed to know. Ryan looked at me for a long moment. Because Mom's gone, he said simply. And you're here, and you're the first person who has ever come into this city with the kind of power to actually do something with what I know. He straightened in his chair. She used to say, you remember how she used to say it? Wait for the right moment, then hit them with everything you have. His voice broke slightly on the last word. He pulled it back. I think this is the moment. I stood up, walked around the table, and put my hand on my brother's shoulder. I didn't have words for what I felt. I wasn't sure words existed for it. I just kept my hand there for a moment, solid and steady. Then I picked up my phone and called Jason Powell. He answered on the second ring. I explained Ryan's testimony in full. What he witnessed, the disappeared statement, Watson's presence on scene, all of it. Powell was silent for a moment when I finished. Then I heard him exhale slowly. I need him to give me a sworn affidavit, Powell said. Today. How soon can he be ready? I looked at Ryan across the kitchen. He was sitting up straight now, shoulders square. 15 years of weight beginning to shift. He's ready now, I said. Jason Powell called at 11 in the morning. I was in the living room going over Ryan's affidavit. Powell had sent a draft copy for review. 12 pages of careful, precise language that turned 15 years of silence into something the law could hold. When my phone buzzed on the coffee table, I picked it up before the second ring. The DOJ opened a preliminary inquiry this morning, Powell said, official on the record. I have the case number. I closed the affidavit draft slowly. I got the confirmation 40 minutes ago. There was something in Powell's voice I hadn't heard before. Not excitement exactly. He was too seasoned for that, but a controlled energy like a man who had been pushing against a locked door and just felt it give. The footage has been formally received into federal evidence. All 3 server copies logged and time-stamped, which means no one at the local level, not Watson, not Lang, not anyone connected to either of them can touch it. It is out of their reach. I sat back against the couch cushions. For a moment, I just breathed. There's more, Powell said. Councilwoman Warren has formally called an emergency city council session for in 2 days. She's requesting Watson's immediate suspension pending investigation. She has 3 other council members already committed to supporting the motion. Lang will block it. He can try, but here's the thing. The story got picked up overnight. Powell paused for effect, and I appreciated that he let the moment exist. National outlet, not a local affiliate. They framed it as a credentialed federal contractor subjected to an unlawful chokehold during a pretextual traffic stop. They used your title. They mentioned the clearance level. Another pause. The comments on that article alone are going to make Lang very uncomfortable. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, Oak Street looked like it always did. Ordinary, quiet, a little worn at the edges. The same street it had been a week ago before any of this started. Nothing had changed out there. Everything had changed in here. What about Emma's citations, I asked. Dropped this morning, all 3. No explanation offered. Powell's tone made clear that no explanation was needed. Someone told Armstrong to cut his losses on that one before it became its own separate headline. I exhaled. Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway, reading my face the way he had always been able to read my face. I gave him a small nod. His shoulders dropped half an inch, the most visible relief I had seen from him in days. After I hung up, I told him everything Powell had said. He listened without interrupting, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Administrative leave, he said. They're actually talking about putting Watson on administrative leave. That's what Powell is hearing. Ryan let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the table, our mother's table, the same one where Evelyn Morgan had sat every morning for 40 years with her Bible and her coffee. And then he looked at me. Mom would have wanted to know every detail of this, he said. She would have been on the phone to everybody she knew. She would have made us eat first, I said. Ryan almost smiled. She always made us eat first. We cooked dinner together that evening for the first time since I had arrived. Nothing elaborate. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about Evelyn, not about the estate or the paperwork or the machine that had been grinding against our family for decades. About her, who she was, the way she laughed, the way she could end an argument with a single look, the way she had kept this house standing through every season this city had thrown at her. It was the best evening I had spent in Maplewood in years. I went to bed that night, feeling something I hadn't felt since before the traffic stop, something light and almost unfamiliar. I felt like it might actually be over. I lay in my mother's bedroom in the dark, listening to the quiet of Oak Street, and let myself believe just for one night that the worst was behind us. I was wrong. By morning, Mayor Lang would make sure of it. My phone rang early the next morning. I was still in bed, not quite asleep, watching the early light come through my mother's floral curtains. I reached for the phone without sitting up. Jason Powell, I pressed it to my ear. Talk to me, I said. Lang moved last night. Powell's voice was measured but tight, the way it got when he was controlling something he didn't want to show. He contacted the private contracting firm that administers my Pentagon clearance, not the Pentagon directly, the civilian intermediary. Wilson Defense Partners. I sat up. He filed a formal security concern, citing my conduct during an active law enforcement encounter. The language is vague enough to be legally deniable, but specific enough to trigger their liability protocols. Powell paused. Wilson suspended your clearance access this morning pending administrative review. Your badge has been deactivated. The room was very still. They can do that? I asked. I already knew the answer, I just needed a second. A formal security concern from any official source triggers an automatic review. They don't investigate first. They suspend first and investigate after. It's how the system is designed. Another pause. Without an active credentialed contractor as the central complainant, the DOJ inquiry loses its primary anchor. It doesn't close, but it stalls significantly. I got out of bed and walked to the window. Oak Street below was just beginning to wake up. A man walking a dog, a woman getting into her car, everything ordinary, everything untouched by what was happening inside this house. He didn't go after the case, I said quietly. He went after me, Powell confirmed. Specifically, he went after what makes you credible. Without the clearance, without the active contractor status, you become easier to reframe. You're no longer a Pentagon analyst who was assaulted during a pretextual stop. You're a suspended contractor with a grievance. He let that sit for a moment. I'm sorry, Kayla. This is a sophisticated move. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass of the window. There's more, Powell said, which was the last thing I wanted to hear. Lang leaked the suspension to the press, all of it. The clearance review, the administrative hold, my name, a beat. It's already running. I opened my laptop on the dresser. The story was everywhere. Every local outlet had it and 2 regional ones. The headlines were nearly identical. Pentagon suspends, young contractor following police dispute. Young. That word exactly where Warren had warned me it would end up. Without context, without the chokehold footage, without the medical report, without 15 years of Watson's buried complaints, it read like a story about an impulsive young woman who had overreacted during a routine traffic stop and was now facing consequences for it. I closed the laptop. Ryan was in the doorway. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there. I hadn't heard him come upstairs. He looked at my face and didn't ask any questions. My face was already telling him everything. I told him anyway, all of it. The contracting firm, the suspended clearance, the stalled DOJ inquiry, the headlines. I told it the same way I always told things, straight, sequential. Nothing softened. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time. They knew exactly what to hit, I said finally. My voice was low, steady, still, the way it always was. But underneath it, something was working very hard to stay that way. They didn't come after what I did. They came after what I'm still building. Ryan crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't offer empty comfort. He knew me well enough to know I didn't want it. He just sat there, present and solid, the way he had always been for me. I stood at the window for a long time. I thought about Kayla Morgan. 81 years in this city, every door that had been closed in her face, every system that had been designed to make her feel small, every year she had kept this house standing anyway. She hadn't done it by pretending the walls weren't there. She had done it by finding the cracks. I looked down at the street, then I looked at my phone. There was one call I hadn't made yet. One person I had deliberately kept out of this because I hadn't wanted to pull that card, hadn't wanted to need it, had wanted to prove I could handle it myself. I scrolled to the contact. General Richard Whitaker, retired. I stared at the name for a long moment, then I put the phone face down on the dresser and went downstairs to wait until midnight. Some calls you didn't make until you were absolutely certain you were ready for. This one I needed to be ready for. The house was quiet by 11. Ryan had gone to bed at 10. After sitting with me through most of the evening, without either of us saying much, the television had been on in the living room. Neither of us watching it, just needing the noise, until Ryan finally stood up, squeezed my shoulder once without a word, and went upstairs. I sat in the dark kitchen and waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for exactly. Maybe for the anger to settle into something I could work with, maybe for the fear, and I was willing to name it that now, alone in the dark with no one watching, to compact itself into something small enough to carry. I had spent the entire day moving through the house in a controlled stillness that had cost me more than I wanted to admit. The headlines still lived on my laptop screen behind the closed lid on the table. The phone sat face up beside my coffee cup. At midnight, I picked it up and dialed. General Richard Whitaker answered on the second ring. Not groggy, not slow, fully present, like a man who had spent 40 years sleeping light and never fully stopped. "Kayla," he said, just my name. That was enough. Something in my chest loosened by a fraction at the sound of his voice. The voice that had told me at 24 years old in an Army intelligence briefing room that I was the sharpest analyst he had seen in 20 years of service. The voice that had written the letter that opened the first Pentagon door. I had not called him because I had not wanted to need him, or I was 36 years old and I had built everything myself, and I was not accustomed to asking for help. I asked for it now. I told him everything, not the compressed tactical version I gave to Powell or Warren. Everything. From the afternoon, I drove to the pharmacy to pick up the notarized document to Watson's flashlight in my face, to Armstrong's forearm across my throat, to the Pentagon, ID held in Watson's thick hands, to Emma Harper, filming from the sidewalk, to the rigged oversight board, to the Gazette article, to Jason Powell, taking the case, to Ryan's 15 years of silence about Zane Tucker, to the DOJ inquiry, opening and then stalling, to Lang contacting Wilson Defense Partners, to the suspended clearance, to the headlines with that word young sitting in them like a verdict. I delivered it the same way I delivered intelligence briefings, sequentially, precisely, without embellishment and without breaking. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call was still connected. "It was a small city mayor," Whitaker said finally. His voice was very quiet. "Using a civilian political office to interfere with a federal contractor's security clearance." He said it slowly, like he was reading a document over a traffic stop. "Yes, sir." Another silence, shorter this time. Kayla, in 30 years of service, I have put a lot of people in front of general officers, a lot of people in high-pressure rooms where everything was on the line. A pause. I have never recommended anyone your age at the level I recommended you. You know why? I waited. Because I knew that when the moment came, and it always comes, you would not break. His voice shifted, still quiet, but with something underneath it now, something that moved like a current. Do you still have the medical documentation of the bruising? Yes. The footage, is it in federal admissible format across multiple secure servers? 3 servers, all time-stamped. Ryan's affidavit. Has Powell finalized it? Final version signed and notarized this afternoon. Good. A brief pause. Don't sleep. I'll be there by morning. The line went quiet. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and sat with my hands flat on the wood. My mother's table worn smooth in the places Evelyn Morgan had rested her own hands for 40 years. The kitchen smelled faintly of the cornbread from dinner. Through the window above the sink, Oak Street was completely dark and completely still. I felt something I hadn't felt since before this started. Not hope exactly. Something harder than hope. Something that didn't depend on how things went. Something that existed whether I won or lost because it was built out of the simple fact that I had done everything right. I had not broken under Armstrong's arm. I had not broken under the headlines. I had not broken in the dark kitchen at the end of the worst day of my adult life. I was still here. And by morning, so would Richard Whitaker. I didn't go to sleep. I made fresh coffee, opened the legal pad, and got back to work. The government vehicle pulled up to Oak Street that morning. I watched it from the front window. Black, clean with government plates and the particular unhurried deliberateness of a car that didn't need to announce itself. It parked in front of Evelyn Morgan's house like it belonged there. 3 doors opened. General Richard Whitaker stepped out first. He was 67 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that didn't come from the military and never left it. He was not in uniform, civilian suit, no tie, but he wore it the way certain men wear everything, like it was a formality the world extended to him rather than the other way around. Behind him came 2 colleagues from the Pentagon's Inspector General office, both carrying leather document cases, and a JAG attorney named Colonel Diane Reeves, who looked like she had been awake since before Whitaker had called her. I opened the front door before they reached the porch. Whitaker looked at my throat first. The bruising had faded to a dull yellow-green over the past several days, but enough remained to be visible in the morning light. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A tightening, contained and professional. "Kayla," he said. "General," I said, "come." I brought them into the kitchen. Ryan came downstairs in a button-up shirt, having heard the car, and stood at the kitchen threshold with the quiet dignity of a man receiving guests in his mother's house. I introduced everyone. Whitaker shook Ryan's hand with both of his. "Your sister," Whitaker said, "is one of the finest analysts I have worked with in my career. I want you to know that." Ryan looked at me. "I know," he said simply. We sat at Evelyn Morgan's table. The general, the 2 IG colleagues, Colonel Reeves, Ryan, and I poured coffee into every cup I owned. It was the most people this kitchen had held since my mother's repass, and for a strange suspended moment, I felt Evelyn in the room. Approving, I thought. My mother would have approved of this table full of people with documents and purpose. Whitaker spoke first. "Here is what happened," he said, laying it out with the clean precision of a man who had spent a lifetime reducing complex situations to their essential facts. Mayor Lang contacted Wilson Defense Partners and filed a security concern using language deliberately vague enough to trigger their automatic liability protocols without being specific enough to be legally accountable. He folded his hands on the table. What he did not account for is that the request originated from a civilian municipal office, not a law enforcement agency, not a federal body, a city mayor. He paused. Using a civilian political office to interfere with a federal contractor's security clearance is not a procedural gray area, Kayla. It is a federal crime. Title 18, Obstruction of Federal Proceedings. Colonel Reeves can walk you through the specific statutes. Colonel Reeves opened her document case without being asked. She walked us through it in plain language. No jargon, no hedging, what Lang had done, what it constituted, what the exposure was. I listened to every word. Beside me, Ryan sat very still. When Reeves finished, Whitaker looked at me. I made 2 calls this morning before I got in the car. The first was to the director of Wilson Defense Partners. Your clearance review has been rescinded. Your access is restored effective immediately. He said it without ceremony, like it was the only reasonable outcome, which it was. The second call was to a colleague at the Deputy Attorney General level, not a complaint intake, a direct call. He paused. The preliminary DOJ inquiry has been elevated to a full federal civil rights investigation as of 45 minutes ago. The kitchen was very quiet. I looked down at my coffee cup for a moment. Then I looked up at the photograph of my mother on the wall. Evelyn at 60, squinting into the sun in the front yard of this very house, daring the world to try something. She taught me everything I know about this city, I said. Whitaker followed my gaze to the photograph. He was quiet for a moment. She raised you in a city that was designed to make sure you didn't have a chance, he said. You had a chance anyway. I nodded once. By noon, Jason Powell had been fully briefed and was preparing for the council session. By early afternoon, Mayor Lang's office had gone very quiet in a way that, in my experience, meant people were beginning to understand exactly how much trouble they were in. The machine was about to meet something it had never encountered before, something that outranked it. The council chamber was standing room only by 6. I arrived with Ryan, Jason Powell, and General Whitaker 30 minutes before the session was called to order. The room was already full. Residents lined the walls 2 deep. Local journalists had claimed every seat in the press row. I recognized faces from the neighborhood. Mrs. Harper from 2 blocks down. 3 men I remembered from my mother's church. A group of young people who couldn't have been older than 20, standing near the back with their arms crossed and their jaws set. Maplewood had been waiting for this room for a long time. I took my seat in the front row. I'd chosen what I wore carefully, a gray blazer, dark slacks, my Pentagon contractor ID on its lanyard, visible at my chest. I was not hiding what I was not softening it. I sat with my back straight and my hands in my lap, and I did not look at Mayor Lang, who was already seated at the mayor's table on the raised platform at the front of the room, but I felt him looking at me. Councilwoman Felicia Warren called the session to order at 6:30. She stood at the council podium with a composure that I recognized immediately. The composure of a woman who had been preparing for this moment for 3 years and was not going to waste a single second of it. That or a tea. This emergency session has been called to address a formal record of conduct by Sergeant Derek Watson of the Maplewood Police Department, Warren said. Her voice carried to every corner of the room without effort. What this council will hear tonight is not one incident. It is a pattern, and that pattern has a history. She nodded to Jason Powell. Powell stood and walked to the podium with a thick binder under his arm. He had spent 48 hours pulling public records, complaint logs, incident reports, dismissal notices, arrest records, and had reconstructed 15 years of buried history into something that could no longer be buried. He presented it methodically. 12 formal complaints against Watson spanning 15 years, names, dates, injuries, dismissal timelines. Henry Bell's fractured arm. Hannah Moore's son stopped 3 times in a single month. The complainant arrested 4 months after his complaint was dismissed, and all of it, every single complaint, reviewed and dismissed by an oversight board appointed entirely by the mayor sitting 10 feet away. The room was very quiet while Powell spoke. When he finished, Warren called Ryan Morgan to the podium. Ryan stood up slowly. He straightened his jacket. I watched him walk to the front of the room and understood watching him what it cost him and what it meant. 58 years old, 30 years at Jefferson High, 15 years of silence that had kept him standing and kept this family intact and eaten at him every single day. He placed his affidavit on the podium and looked out at the room. He told them about Zane Tucker, about the night in August 2009, about what he saw on that street 3 blocks from Zane's mother's house, about the statement he gave that disappeared, about the friendly visit from Lang's office to Jefferson High the following week. He told it plainly, without drama, without embellishment. The plain telling was the most powerful thing in the room. When he sat back down beside me, I pressed my hand briefly over his. Then, Warren called Emma Harper. Emma walked to the front of the room in her work uniform, natural hair pulled back, chin level. She was 29 years old, and she had a 6-year-old at home with a babysitter, and she had been cited on fabricated violations and had her name posted online as a warning. She stood at the podium, and she did not shake. She connected her phone to the council chamber's display system. She pressed play. The footage filled the screen at the front of the room. Clear afternoon light. Maple Avenue. I standing on the sidewalk with my hands visible. Armstrong's arm coming up hard across my throat. Watson standing there watching it happen, not intervening, not hesitating, watching. Then, my voice cutting through the silence, steady and absolute, saying the words. Then, Armstrong's arm dropping. Then, Watson's face reading the Pentagon ID. All of it, every second. The chamber was completely silent. I sat in the front row and did not look at the screen. I had seen it enough times. I watched the room instead. I watched the faces of the council members. I watched the journalists writing. I watched the residents standing along the walls with their arms at their sides. I watched Mayor Lang. He was staring at the screen. His face had gone the color of old paper. He could not look away, and he could not look at anyone around him. When the footage ended, Warren called for a vote on Watson's immediate suspension. It was unanimous. Lang did not vote against it. He didn't vote at all. I was at the kitchen table when Powell called. It was 8:15 in the morning one day after the council session. I had slept 4 hours, real sleep, for the first time in days, and was on my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. I picked it up without checking the screen. "It just came through," Powell said. "No greeting? He didn't need one." The Pentagon statement. "You need to hear this." I heard him unfold something paper. I set my coffee cup down. He read it aloud. It was 2 paragraphs, clean, formal, and precise in the way that only institutions with real power could afford to be precise. The first paragraph confirmed my full name, my title, my contractor status with the Office of Special Programs, and my clearance level. It stated that the administrative review of my security credentials had been rescinded in its entirety and that my access had been fully restored. The second paragraph noted that an attempt by a civilian municipal official to interfere with a cleared federal contractor's security status through improper political channels had been referred for active federal review under Title 18. 2 paragraphs, the weight of the entire United States Department of Defense behind every single word. When Powell finished reading, neither of us spoke for a moment. "How long before Watson's attorney sees that?" I asked. "He's already seen it," Powell said. "I know because he stopped returning Mayor Lang's calls approximately 40 minutes ago." I looked out the kitchen window at Oak Street. An ordinary morning, a woman walking a stroller, a man hosing down his front steps. The same street it had always been. "What's next?" I asked. Powell's voice shifted into the tone I had come to recognize over the past 8 days. Focused, forward-moving, a man who had been waiting a long time for ground this solid to stand on. "Federal investigators are moving on Lang today. The documentation trail from the Wilson interference alone is enough for obstruction charges. But when they pulled his communications records this morning, they found this wasn't his first time using his office to pressure federal contractors and law enforcement proceedings. It goes back years." A pause. "He's going to be served before noon." "Genre." Ryan came into the kitchen and looked at my face. I held up one finger. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from me without a word. "Armstrong," I said, cooperating fully. "His attorney made the call yesterday evening after the council footage aired nationally." Powell's tone didn't soften exactly, but it became deliberate. He provided a detailed statement covering 3 years of Watson's conduct, specific incidents, specific dates, specific names. It significantly strengthens the federal case. A beat. He will lose his badge and face criminal charges. His cooperation affects the degree, not the fact. And the other complainants, Henry Bell's case has been formally reopened by the State Attorney General's office as of this morning, so have the 2 others that were dismissed under Lang's oversight board. Powell paused. "And Kayla," The Zane Tucker case. The state AG contacted Ryan's attorney directly. They are treating his affidavit as a primary witness document and opening a full investigation. I looked at Ryan across the table. I lowered the phone for a moment. The Tucker case is being investigated, I said. State level. Something moved across Ryan's face that I didn't have a name for. It was too large and too old for a single name. He put both hands flat on the table and looked down at them and nodded once slowly, like a man receiving something he had stopped believing would ever come. I put the phone back to my ear. The civil suit, I said, filed this morning. Powell's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man doing exactly what he was built for. 7 plaintiffs. In addition to yourself, Emma Harper, Henry Bell, and 5 individuals whose suppressed complaints I recovered from public record. The suit names the city of Maplewood, the police department, and Watson personally. He paused. I expect a settlement conversation within 60 days. The number they'll need to offer to make this go away will be significant enough to make news. I hung up and sat with my hands around my coffee cup. By noon, Leonard Lang had been served with a federal subpoena on the steps of City Hall. By 2, his attorney had issued a brief statement saying the mayor was cooperating with investigators. By 4, Lang had resigned. A short hollow letter that explained nothing and satisfied no one. By evening, every local outlet that had run the headline, "Pentagon suspends young contractor," was running a different story entirely. Ryan cooked dinner. We ate at our mother's table and didn't talk about any of it. We didn't need to. The house was quiet in a different way now. Not the heavy, grief-soaked quiet of the first night when I had sat on my mother's bed with the photograph and felt the weight of everything Evelyn Morgan had left behind. This was something else, lighter, like a room after a window has been opened for the first time in years. I sat on the edge of that same bed, holding that same photograph. In just a short time. That was all it had been. A short time since I had driven down Maple Avenue on a simple errand and had a man's arm put across my throat on a public sidewalk. A short time that had moved like months, dense and exhausting and completely, irreversibly transforming. I studied my mother's face in the photograph. Evelyn at 60 squinting into the sun in the front yard. That look on her face like she was daring the world to come at her. 81 years in Maplewood, Georgia. 81 years of navigating a machine that had been built piece by piece to make sure women like her stayed small and quiet and grateful for whatever they were allowed to have. Evelyn Morgan had never been small. She had never been quiet, and she had never, not once, been grateful for less than she deserved. I set the photograph down on the nightstand, exactly where I had found it. The estate was fully settled. The house would pass to Ryan. He had stayed. He had kept it standing. It was his. Jason Powell had called the day before. His voice had carried the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 20 years fighting for moments exactly like this one, and was now living inside several of them at once. Derek Watson had been arrested, not suspended, not placed on leave. Arrested. Federal marshals had shown up at his house on Thursday morning, not local officers, not city police, federal marshals, and walked him out in handcuffs in front of his neighbors. The federal civil rights charges carried a maximum sentence of 10 years. Powell had also filed criminal charges in connection with the Zane Tucker case, which the state attorney general's office, embarrassed by 15 years of institutional failure and suddenly very motivated to demonstrate otherwise, had taken up with a speed that suggested they understood exactly how this looked. Watson's attorney had already approached Powell about a plea arrangement. Powell had declined to discuss it. He intended to take it to trial and intended to win. Mayor Leonard Lang had not simply resigned. He had been escorted from City Hall by federal agents 2 days after the council session, when investigators executing a search warrant discovered that the security concern he had filed against my contracting firm was one of at least 11 instances of political interference with law enforcement and federal processes over his 8 years in office. His personal bank records, subpoenaed within 72 hours of the warrant, revealed payments that his attorney was now working very hard to explain. He had been charged with obstruction of federal proceedings, abuse of public office, and witness intimidation. He was currently out on a bond that had cost him his house. His brother-in-law was in federal custody. His career was not over. It had been dismantled piece by piece in public in a way that left nothing intact to rebuild from. Tyler Armstrong had lost his badge, his pension, and his freedom. His cooperation had not been as useful as his attorney had hoped, and Powell had made certain the judge understood that the arm around my throat had belonged to Armstrong and no one else. He had been sentenced to 18 months and would serve every day of it. Powell had read me the sentencing statement over the phone. I had listened to the whole thing without speaking. The civil suit was moving fast. Powell expected a settlement offer within 60 days. A number, he told me, that would make headlines in Maplewood for years. My Pentagon clearance had been formally reinstated and documented in my official file, with a notation that it had been improperly challenged through civilian political interference. The Inspector General's office had opened a full review of Wilson Defense Partners. A formal commendation from the Pentagon's Office of Special Programs was already in writing, citing my conduct throughout the incident as exemplary. The Tucker family had been contacted. Zane Tucker's mother, 73 years old, still living 3 blocks from where her son had died, had agreed to meet with the state attorney general's investigators. It was not enough. 15 years was not something that a phone call fixed, but it was a door opening on a room that had been sealed shut. And sometimes that was where justice had to start, not with everything, but with something real. Emma Harper had received a formal written apology from the city of Maplewood and a separate letter from the police commissioner. A new one appointed after the old one resigned in the wake of Watson's arrest, acknowledging the department's failure to protect her as a material witness. She had called me when the letters arrived. "I'm framing both of them," Emma said. "To remember they apologized," I asked, "to show my daughter what it looks like when you don't back down." Councilwoman Warren had called that morning. She was running for state legislature on Maplewood, on all of it. Early polling already had her 12 points ahead. I picked up my go-bag from the floor beside the bed. I heard Ryan's footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, our mother's doorway, always our mother's, and looked at me the way he had looked at me our whole lives, like he was still a little amazed I existed. We went downstairs together and walked out the front door into the Georgia morning. The air was cool and clean. Oak Street was waking up. A neighbor pulling out of her driveway, a child on a bicycle. An ordinary day, beginning the way ordinary days do, unaware of what had shifted beneath it to make it possible. We stood on the front walk and held each other for a long time. No words. We didn't need them. When I pulled back, Ryan's eyes were bright. He nodded once. I put on my sunglasses, checked the exits out of habit, and walked to the rental car, head level, shoulders back, unhurried, unbroken. I pulled away from the curb and drove down Oak Street one last time, past Mrs. Harper's house, past Maple Avenue, past the pharmacy I had never made it to that afternoon. My mother's voice found me at the highway. "Wait for the right moment, then hit them with everything you have." I pressed the accelerator and drove toward the sun. After everything that unfolded on those Georgia streets, with my mother's quiet strength still whispering through the walls of our family home, the one lesson that wrapped itself around my heart and refuses to let go is this: no matter how powerless you feel in the moment, when a stranger's arm is crushing your throat on a public sidewalk or years of buried pain are staring back at you from your brother's eyes, your truth, spoken clearly and backed by every ounce of proof you can gather, has the power to shatter systems that have stood unchallenged for decades. I was just a grieving daughter, 36 years old, but feeling 12 again in my mother Evelyn's bedroom. Yet that single decision not to stay silent turned fear into fuel, silence into testimony, and a small-town machine of intimidation into federal accountability. Ryan's 15 years of carrying the weight of what he witnessed that night with Zane Tucker finally lifted when he saw me refuse to break. And Emma Harper's steady hand on her phone became the spark that protected her little girl and every other witness who'd been scared into deleting their evidence. This fight taught me that real courage isn't loud or flashy. It's the steady breath you take when panic wants to own you, the documents you save when your clearance is stripped away, and the family you lean on when the headlines try to paint you as just another young woman overreacting. It showed me that justice doesn't always come fast or easy, but it does come when we choose to go over the broken system instead of through it, carrying our mother's daring spirit like a shield. If this story stirred something deep in your chest, the way it still stirs mine every time I touch that faded bruise photo, tell me in the comments right now, what's the one life lesson you're carrying forward from my journey? And if you want more stories that hit this hard, that remind you never to stay silent when it matters, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. We're in this together. Your voice matters here too.